in this video, I want to start a new series talking a little bit more about friend Moten and Harney and their relationship to the workers' strike resolution. I think that this will be a really interesting set of arguments for people to develop. I obviously think that on this resolution, you'll probably see people reading things like militant preservation, but I definitely want to talk about some other responses and things that can kind of be discussed on the workers' strike resolution, because I think it's a really interesting place to talk about a lot of the arguments that Moten and Harney are really making when they're kind of like speaking through Foucault and talking about governance and really making arguments about like different forms of passive governance. And I think that there are a lot of really interesting ways to think about how the kind of like move for states to recognize like passive resistance, such as the workers' strike, kind of like feeds into a lot of the arguments that Moten and Harney are really making about the relationship between policy and planning, and about the relationship between like blackness and governmentality. And I think that kind of like starting there can be a really interesting place to like think about the workers' strike and like how we can both respond to it, and like what types of arguments can be made on the affirmative and negative in order to kind of like craft like something a little bit particularly different. I think that when I'm generally just trying to figure out like what are some of the most like central and pertinent arguments that Moten and Harney are making, the first place I'm really thinking about is policy and planning. I think that this argument is like extremely good on this resolution, because I feel like the resolution from the perspective of Moten and Harney is like literally the attempt of policy to subsume planning. Moten and Harney make a lot of arguments when they're talking about the jurisdictional principle, when they're talking about Foucault and governmentality, that is kind of like about how the state kind of like passively works to accumulate and consume radical resistance and folds people into like belief, hope, or like violence within the state by its ability to like assume acceptance of those that are like doing radical planning. The argument about the difference between policy and planning is that planning has this like refusal to be captured by institutionality, that it's this kind of set of fugitive tactics that is continuing to be remade, and that like policy makers and policy planners basically attempt to consume these kind of like radical tactics, movements, etc., fugitive moments, by attempting to like show them as accepted, right? And so I think that the idea of like the worker strike basically being an alias for this assumption of like all resistance and like the necessary basis for how people are able to assert resistance is like a really interesting way to talk about how that subsumption happens, and it's like the place where I think I would start a lot of like my core criticisms of the resolution, because I think it allows you to make a lot of arguments about like how Moten and Harney's kind of thesis, especially when they start getting into questions of like parentology, and are really breaking down like the particular relationship that blackness has towards Marxism and the worker as a subject, then you have a lot of really interesting ways to talk about the intersection between that kind of like collusion and the ability of the state to think about like the worker strike as the basis for like what could be like the kind of like recognition of like basically citizenship and agency, right? And I think that that's a really interesting place, because I feel like when you're thinking about this as a place to start like affirmative arguments, you have this kind of like strong argument about like how that for Moten and Harney about how the kind of consumption of planners, the attempt to like take the radical kind of like energy away from planners through like policy, is basically the ability to like de-radicalize and basically continue like forms of like anti-black colonial genocide, right? And so I think that there are a lot of really interesting ways from an affirmative argument you can make about how like our resistance movements have to be socialized in such a way that the state has to be destituted, that we have to refuse its kind of ability to properly recognize, because that like socio-political investment is kind of like what keeps like it in power. And I feel like there are so many interesting arguments that interact with them and people like Jack Halberstam that really have like interesting engagements with the idea of what it means to kind of like refuse the state's power to properly recognize and to destitute like the meaning of these types of offices and whatnot. And I think that that type of like possible use is like really, really interesting in terms of the way it kind of opens you up to a bunch of different methods that can either be about like how we should just organize movements differently altogether, which is kind of like where you get to like the militant preservation question, or the kind of like secondary question of just like how can we explicitly create a type of method that refuses the state's like power to recognize in the first place, which I think really sits with like the core of the resolution. And I think some type of destituting destituent argument that it is about like the ways in which people take that up fugitively would be a really, really interesting way to engage some of the core like questions on the resolution. I think that when you kind of like flip that and then think about like what is the way that that turns into like strong negative strategies outside of just like the policy versus planning stuff as a top level link, I feel like you have so many good arguments about like, especially if teams try to like spin into like modeling impact or international relationships impacts that have to do with like modeling the right to recognize workers, that you have so many arguments about why it's kind of that kind of like proves the argument about how the kind of like subsumption of resistance is about the kind of like continued sustainability and self-preservation of sovereignty, and not the actual like betterment of like how these like groups and marginalized folk are like actually existing and like surviving in the world. And then I feel like you have like a bunch of like negative arguments to also work off of against the softer left Avs that allows you to really tell a history about like how insidious it is for the state's particular relationships, because the juris generative principle, when Moten and Harney are really talking about it, is this thing that is both about like the ways in which blackness like has this ability to make and break the law, but also the way in which like blackness is kind of like constantly like under pulverization from the state because of this capacity, which is why the state is constantly at war with itself, right? And it produces like these violent, traumatizing scenes of violence. And so I feel like this is where you start to get a lot of really interesting arguments that can be made from like the kind of like same frame as like the move to innocence, or the idea of like these movements being like basically a way to like stir passivity and people that do like radical, you know, militant ways of occupying and taking down spaces. And I think that there are a lot of really good arguments being made about like how the kinds of like proliferation of things like the plan's like singular kind of recognition of resistance ultimately create and justify the types of polarization that happen under those types of governance. And I think that being able to like weigh that type of offense is really strong if you're able to accompany it with arguments about how Moten and Harney are saying that those very like social investments, those very political investments, are the ones that are constantly moving us closer towards climate disaster, are the ones that are constantly moving us closer to a more like violent and fascist state, because of the way in which it allows like liberal expansion to become part of the way in which fascism is able to retain its power. And I think that being able to theorize the debate through that question is like really, really important. And I think that being able to have that as like the way that you can generate negative link arguments against like whatever other type of advantages that people read, I think that sticking with this strong core is a really good base to kind of work out of, and also allows you to have a really good set of responses to the normative things that people would read against, like something like pessimism. And it forces teams, I think, to have a really on point response to what Moten and Harney are really like thinking of specifically, rather than just like a generic answer to the question of like whether reformism is good or bad, because the argument is about why like what is thought of as good reformism still ends up in the violent erasure, like genocide and subsumption of like various types of groups that exist within marginalization. So yeah, hopefully this video is helpful, and hopefully you'll keep tuning in for more. Thanks.